The Something You Should Know podcast today is sponsored by Audible.com. You can get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial to their service by simply going to audibletrial.com/SYSK. That's audibletrial.com/SYSK. Today on Something You Should Know, Googling your medical symptoms. What can it hurt? Well, it turns out internet medical advice, even from the reputable websites, may not be worth much. Plus, who wouldn't want to be more persuasive? And I've got probably the leading expert on how persuasion works. Dr. Robert Cialdini says, for example, when you present an idea to your boss,
don't ask for his or her opinion. Instead, ask for his or her advice.
Because the research shows
when people are asked for their advice about something, they are put in a cooperative partnership-like state of mind, and they become more supportive.
Also, are you crazy if you talk to yourself out loud? Kids do it all the time. Should you? We'll find out all this today on Something You Should Know.
Something you should know. Fascinating intel, the world's top experts, and practical advice you can use in your life today.
The Something You Should Know podcast
with Mike Carruthers.
Hi, and welcome. And first, thanks to all the people who have sent in feedback on the new podcast here. It's been very gratifying. We've been up and doing the Something You Should Know podcast now for a couple of weeks, and I've gotten so much great response on Facebook and Twitter and in email, and lots of great reviews on iTunes, which I really appreciate. And feel free to tell your friends, too, because I love getting new listeners. And again, thank you for the support and the feedback to the new podcast. First up today, who hasn't Googled their own medical symptoms? I mean, when something seems wrong medically, it's just easy to sit down at the computer and search for your symptoms to see what's up. But how accurate are those search results? Well, a study published by the Journal of the American Medical Association tested 234 doctors against 23 online symptom checkers, including WebMD, which is a popular one and considered to be very authoritative, and the Mayo Clinic. And they did this with 45 hypothetical patients who had their own symptoms and their own medical history. Now, the physicians, the doctors, were able to correctly diagnose 72% of the patients, and that's without running any tests. It's just based on the information given. While the symptom checkers could only correctly diagnose 34% of the patients. And when it came to more serious conditions, doctors were even more accurate than even the best symptom checking tools. The concern here is that if people check their symptoms online and think they've got the complete story, they may then avoid going to the doctor, which could have very serious consequences. So if you think you're sick, it's fine to check your symptoms online, but you should probably also visit the doctor. And that is something you should know. Being persuasive, it's important if you want to get people to buy into your ideas. So how can you be more persuasive? Well, the person to ask that question to is Dr. Robert Cialdini. Robert has authored a best-selling book. It's been out for several years now called Influence. The book was very popular. It's still very popular. And he has a new book out called Pre-suasion, which is really interesting. I'll let him tell you about it. Welcome, Robert. So Influence, which is really, that's become the textbook on persuasion in many people's eyes, and it's been out for years. So what could possibly be new? How is the contents of the new book, Pre-suasion, different from the Influence book?
Well, as opposed to Influence, which covers what best to build into a message to get agreement, Pre-suasion describes the process of gaining agreement with a message before it's been sent. Although that may seem like some form of magic, it's not. It's established science.
So maybe an example would help.
Sure. In one study, for example, researchers approached individuals and asked for help for a marketing survey. Only 29 agreed to participate. But if the researchers approached a second sample of individuals and preceded that request with a simple, persuasive question, do you consider yourself a helpful person? Now 77.3% volunteered. Why? When asked before the request if they were helpful, nearly everyone said yes. Then, when the request occurred, most agreed to participate in order to be consistent with the recently activated idea of themselves as helpful people.
Wow, that's pretty persuasive.
Well, to go from 29% to 77%, we don't see those kinds of effects typically. But that's the power of persuasion, in which we get people in a mindset, in a frame of mind that makes them receptive to our message.
So, but this could be perceived as, and perhaps even used as, a trick. I mean, I can see the used car salesman putting his arm around the guy and saying, now, you really want to buy a new car today, don't you? And that it kind of has that kind of car salesman-y approach.
This is a real concern of mine, is that it can be used for unethical purposes. But if you have a particular strength about your message, what I'm advocating to do persuasion ethically is to first raise to consciousness in your audience an idea that's related to your strength, so that they go to that particular dimension, that particular element of your message that is wisest for them to take into account in deciding what to do.
So are there some good examples, things you can point to of how this has worked that we might get a better sense of this?
Well, I can give you an example of a friend of mine who just is not a friend of mine, but an acquaintance. Suppose you're applying for a job, right? Typically, what we say is at the beginning of that interview is, I want to answer all your questions as fully as possible, but I'm going to recommend that we say one more thing. Before we start, I wonder if you could answer a question for me. Why did you invite me to interview today? As a consequence, your interviewers will start hearing themselves saying positive things about you and your qualifications, putting them in a state of mind that is favorable to your candidacy before you make your case for it. I have an acquaintance who swears he's gotten 3 better jobs in a row by employing this persuasive technique.
That's fascinating. And
what I like about it is you're just drawing people to your strengths. It's not that you're tricking them in some way. You're just putting them in mind of. You're putting them in a position to be focused on that thing that you consider wisest for them to take into account in selecting you.
But even you said that, this is something that concerns you, that it be used unethically, and
right.
you can see where this could be considered like a sales trick,
Yes, and so we've done some research on what happens to organizations that use influence techniques like this as a trick, as a device, right? And what we found is that in organizations that allow their people to use influence techniques dishonestly, what happens is those people who are uncomfortable with the dishonesty leave, right? And what remains is a precipitate of people who are comfortable with cheating, and they cheat the organization. They pad their expense accounts. They steal equipment. They generate under-the-table deals with business partners or vendors. And so that's the legacy of an organization that allows their people to use this unethically. So the lesson is for any leader to be scrupulous about using these strategies in only the most ethical way.
Why do you suppose, or what does the research say, why this is so powerful? What's going on in my head that made me not want to participate before and now I do?
This is the core question for persuasion. What's the mechanism that makes it work so powerful? And it has to do with a particular cognitive mistake that we make. When we pay attention to some idea, in the moment when we are paying attention to it, we elevate its importance from the moment before, compared to the moment before. And so, if we are focused on a particular idea, right, some factor, right, that we have been drawn to, we assume that because we are paying attention to it, it must warrant that attention. But that's not true, because we can be brought to an idea by a communicator who draws our focus to that particular idea. And that's what causes us to then overestimate its importance, and then act in such a way as to be consistent with an important dimension.
What other ways can this be used? Well, what other situations, and then how would you phrase that to whet people's appetite of the variety of situations this works?
Suppose you have a plan or a new initiative, and you want your boss to get on board with it. When you present your plan, don't ask for his or her opinion on this plan. Instead, ask for his or her advice on the plan. Because there's research that shows when people are asked for their advice about something, they are put in a cooperative partnership-like state of mind, and they become more supportive of the plan or idea as a consequence. If they're asked for an opinion, they step back from you. They go into themselves rather than to go into a mindset of collaboration. So there's an old saying, when we ask for advice, we're usually looking for an accomplice, right? I'd only add, on the basis of scientific evidence, that if we get that advice, we usually get that accomplice. And what better partner to have on a project than somebody in charge?
I don't know if you looked at this, but does this work on children?
Yes, it does work on children. There was a study done in Belgium in which subjects were brought into an experiment and shown pictures of people either standing apart from one another or standing together in a togetherness kind of depiction. Right? Then the researcher stood up from the table and dropped a box of pencils on the floor, and they asked, well, which of these two types of subjects get down on the floor and start helping the researcher? Those who saw initially two people standing together in these photographs, they had the mindset of togetherness, were 300% more likely to get down on the floor and help. Now, here's the thing that made me glad I was sitting down when I read about this study. The subjects were 18 months old.
Whoa, really?
They were babies. And this process is so fundamental, so primitive to human functioning, that it worked on 18 months old. infants.
So we're like pre-wired this way.
That's exactly right. This is how we think. When we are asked to pay attention to a particular concept like togetherness, we see togetherness as important, and so we act in a way that's consistent with the idea of togetherness or cooperation in this instance.
But there must be times when it doesn't work, and when it doesn't work, why doesn't it work?
Well, there are times when it doesn't work if you draw people's attention to a particular concept, let's say authority or expertise, right? Because people want to follow the lead of experts, right? So you draw their attention to the concept of expertise, and then they go into your message, and you don't have a lot of expertise. Now, you've made expertise important in a way that will cause people to move away from you. So that's why not only is it effective and ethical, right, to decide what is the greatest strength of your offer, right, and use that as the idea you begin the interaction with, even before you begin your appeal, right? Because that will draw people to the thing that will make it most wise for them to move in your direction.
When you do this in conversation with people, is it invisible? Do they get a sense, or maybe later when they're lying in bed going, "Hey, wait a minute"?
It's invisible. It's invisible. You never recognize that what happens before a message is designed to leverage the essence of that message before it even is delivered. Right? I'll give you another example that's so under the radar, no one recognizes it. One of the goals we often have in business is to get people to change, to move away from their old habits, old practices into better new approaches. And that's difficult because people resist moving from their comfort zone. Right? It turns out that you will be more successful if you ask for change at the beginning of the month or the beginning of the week. Because at the start of a block of time, people are more receptive to the idea of change. We know that's true at the beginning of the year, right? That's where we make all our New Year's resolutions. Well, it turns out there's research that shows the same thing applies at the beginning of a month or the beginning of a week. If you did that to get somebody to change in your direction, do you think they would ever recognize that you did it on a Monday? Of course not.
What about beginning of the day?
Beginning of the day, that hasn't actually been examined, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, it feels right, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That people...
It's a time for new starts. My book, Pre-suasion, is scheduled to come out on September 6th. Do you know why we chose that? It's the day after Labor Day. It's the end of summer and the beginning of getting back to work. This isn't a book that was designed for the beach or the mountains, right? It's a book that's designed for the workplace. So we did it at the beginning of the autumn.
Well, that makes sense. But why not January?
Well, there were other reasons. We can't always wait till January.
That's right. Yeah.
If you've got a good idea and if you've got a new way of thinking about things and you want people to change, well, you do have the beginning of the day, the beginning of the week, and the beginning of the month to choose. Much more manageable.
When you look at this topic, and you certainly, given your previous book and your reputation, are the guy to write this book. But why hasn't this been addressed before? I mean, this seems so obvious. What's taken so long?
It turns out it has been recognized. In writing my first book, I infiltrated sales training and marketing training and fundraising training operations to see what worked in the broadest set of circumstances. And what I saw was only a very rarefied few understood pre-suasion. Everybody else was focused on building the strongest case inside their message. The pre-suaders, the aces of these industries, recognized that it doesn't matter how good the seed is that you want to plant if you haven't cultivated the earth first. They acted like expert gardeners, recognizing that you have to pre-treat the ground that you put your seed in order to make it flourish.
Interesting.
But only a very few recognize that.
What's interesting about the whole idea of pre-suasion is, it seems so obvious once you explain it. It's like you're priming the pump. You're getting people ready to agree with you or to follow you, so that when you ask them to agree or follow you, they do. It's great. And you've certainly made the case with your examples and the research you cite that it really is a powerful technique. Robert Cialdini is my guest, author of the landmark book Influence, and his new book is out called Pre-suasion. Thanks, Robert. The podcast today is sponsored by Audible.com, and in fact, you can get Robert Cialdini's books as audiobooks on Audible.com, and you can select one of them to be your free audiobook download when you take advantage of Audible's 30-day free trial and free audiobook download, no cost or obligation. Just go to audibletrial.com/SYSK. audibletrial.com/SYSK. The SYSK is something you should know, the name of this podcast, and then it tells Audible how you found them. audibletrial.com/SYSK. And if you're not into audiobooks, it's such a great way and such a different way to consume a book when you can't sit and read it. And I really recommend you try if you haven't. audibletrial.com/SYSK. And finally today on the Something You Should Know podcast, are you crazy if you talk to yourself? Well, turns out you'd probably be crazy if you didn't. There's been a lot of research on people who talk to themselves out loud, and it can actually help us to succeed. You see kids do it all the time. Talking to themselves helps kids to stay on task, especially when it involves multiple steps. And the same trick works for grown-ups too. Talking yourself down the aisle of a grocery store or while navigating an unfamiliar route actually enhances your focus and helps ensure you don't miss a step or you don't forget something on your shopping list. I actually saw somebody doing this in the store once, and it was right around the time I read this thing. And at first I thought, well, this guy's nuts. He's talking to himself going down his shopping list. And but maybe he read the same thing, because it does turn out to be very helpful in helping you not miss a step, not miss anything on your list, and it enhances your focus. So talking to yourself is just fine. That's it for the podcast today, which has been sponsored by Audible.com. For your free 30-day trial and free audiobook download, go to audibletrial.com/SYSK. audibletrial.com/SYSK. I'm Mike Carruthers. If you have a moment, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to the podcast. I would appreciate that. And again, thanks for all the positive feedback on Facebook and Twitter and everything. And if you can help spread the word, I love getting more listeners. And if you can help me out, I would certainly appreciate it. I'm Mike Carruthers. Thanks for listening to Something You Should Know.